Welcome to this event this evening. This event is being taken up in partnership with Eden Project in Cornwall, with Lancaster University, with Morecambe Bay Curriculum, with Eden Project North. We're really excited to be talking to you about education in the context of a climate crisis. My name's Jo Knight. I'm co-chairing this evening in partnership with Gabriella, who will introduce herself shortly. We have 6 fantastic speakers who are going to give short 5 minutes presentations, and then after each, we're going to run those all together, and then we're going to be asking those speakers some questions about the things they've been talking about. And after that, there'll be an opportunity for people to send questions in as well, and our speakers will be able to answer your questions directly tonight. So thank you very much to everyone that's attending. It's lovely to see you, at least virtually, and I will now hand over to Gabby. Thanks very much, Gabby.
Good evening. I'm Gabriella Gilkes. I'm the Science Engagement Manager for Eden Project International, and I look after partnerships and research opportunities for Eden Project North. Thanks so much to our speakers for joining us this evening. I'm now going to hand over and ask Sam Kendall if we can hear from her. Hi, Sam.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Sam Kendall, and my role is Education Manager at Eden Project Cornwall. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce you to our work with children and young people, their schools and their teachers. I really hope you're familiar with Eden Project in Cornwall. If you're not, we've got a very shiny new website, so you can have a quick look there. But you might know about us that we've got the largest rainforest in captivity and a Mediterranean landscape inside giant geodesic domes in mid-Cornwall in a transformed china clay quarry. And it's home to a collection of plants and their stories from all over the world. Perhaps you visited us and are aware of us as a tourist destination, but at its heart, Eden Project is an educational charity, which we run as a social enterprise with a mission to create a movement that builds relationships between people and the natural world, and in so doing, demonstrate the power of people working together for nature. So it's worth saying that that site itself is an important part of our education approach. There is, I think, something about that story of transformation from china clay quarry that had reached the end of its economic life, that is really compelling as a symbol of transformation and possibility that demonstrates what people can achieve when they're working together for nature. And the way that we run that site is really important too. So sustainable and ethical principles are absolutely fundamental to the way that we run our business. And for example, we've just published our net zero carbon strategy. We plan to be climate positive by 2030. And one of the keystones of that is our geothermal project. So we're currently drilling at 4.5 kilometres deep on the kind of outer reaches of our site to reach the fracture zone in the Cornish granite, which will give us renewable heat for our biomes. And when we drill our second hole, renewable baseload electricity as well. And so this gives the real authenticity in our education work, because we're really walking the talk on this stuff and not just telling people woulds and shoulds, we're actually doing it. In our education work, we frame that Eden mission about building relationships between people and nature in terms of a vision for children and young people who are inspired, motivated and equipped to create and thrive in a better future for all living things. And as far as we're concerned, that's absolutely a project of head, hands and heart. We want that heart-led motivation and inspiration to work together for nature, grounded in a deep connection with the natural world. We need young people with the knowledge and thinking skills to understand and manage the life support systems we live within and the complex problems that we face. And we need to resource our young people with the skills, the resilience and the creativity to be able to do that hard stuff. So this sense of developing young people's agency to act is really important to us. But we also know that young people can't do it on their own, and they need to be supported by teachers and adults with the confidence and the capacity to create new kinds of learning. And they need to be part of thriving, biodiverse and sustainable schools and communities as well. So that's why we work in lots of different ways. We work directly with children and young people at our Eden Project Cornwall site and online, from early years to undergraduate and beyond. And those programmes respond to Eden's mission, they respond to the national curriculum, and the unique opportunities for learning presented by Eden. We provide consultancy and training and support for teachers and schools so that they can transform their setting and their practice to embed nature-based approaches. And this includes a really exciting partnership with the local multi-academy trust, who are opening a net zero carbon free school just up the road from us, which will also be home to the first Eden Project nursery for children. We've already got one for plants. And we also create resources for teachers to enabling the furthering of Eden's mission in a school's context. So in terms of our approach to these big stories and big topics, I've got about a minute left to try and capture 20 years of action research into education for sustainability at the Eden Project. But I'll just talk to three fundamental principles for us, which are connection, the idea of a narrative-led or story-inspired approach, and agency. Let me give you a flavour. In spring next year, we'll be publishing a free resource called Paradise Pastures, which we've developed and trialled with a local primary school. The narrative hook, the story inspiration for children to engage with this piece of learning, is a tiny letter and a yarn from a group of tiny residents of their school grounds called the Whatifs, asking for the children's help as they're faced with the prospect of a great mowing. So, guided by information from the Whatifs, the children undertake various scientific inquiries and investigations into the biodiversity of their school grounds. And in so doing, they're building connection between themselves and their local place and their local nature, connections between their learning in and outside of the classrooms, and connections between their practical and more theoretical science learning. The final message from the Whatifs asks the children to use their new knowledge to take action for biodiversity in their local place, building and enabling the development of children's agency. It also inspired one of my all-time favourite quotes from a participating child who's really wrestling with some big ideas coming out of the programme. And that's what I'm going to leave you with this evening. This is a 10-year-old from Roach Primary School who said, "Science is finding out things that maybe not been founded out before, or investigating things that people have little noticed, or even big noticed, but still not found out the true meaning." Thank you very much, everybody.
Wow, that's fantastic and completely on time. So thank you so much for that, Sam. I'm now going to hand over and ask. Okay, so this evening I'm going to hand over to Rob Barrett and ask to hear from him. Hi, good evening, Rob.
Good evening, Gabby. Thank you very much. Good evening, folks. And thank you to Sam for just a fantastic and inspiring talk before me. How can I follow that? But simply, if you haven't visited Eden, it's on your bucket list, please do it. And obviously the website's fantastic and there are some really amazing things going on there. I think I visited sometime after, I don't know, early 90s, and my sort of love affair literally with Eden has continued. So it is an amazing place to visit. So please do if you can. So as I say, good evening. My name is Professor Robert Barrett, and I'm the Eden Project North Chair of Education and Engagement at Lancaster University. And that's a joint post supported by the Eden Project. What I'd like to do this evening is share with you the Morecambe Bay curriculum, which you may have heard of through children in schools or through local residents in the Morecambe Bay area. And what this is a positive response to the planetary emergency, and in particular climate change. And as you may know or not know, if you've not visited Morecambe Bay, it's 120 square miles of the largest intertidal mudflats and sand in the United Kingdom. Phenomenal sunsets, just an incredibly inspiring place to be and live. But the Morecambe Bay curriculum did this. It answered yes to this question. Are we morally obligated to the health of nature first, and secondly, to those that follow us? And we know that we have to live within the limits of our planetary boundaries. And there are 9 that we know of at the moment, climate change being one of them, and within our Earth systems as well. So the Morecambe Bay curriculum then, therefore, is a disruptive approach that challenges not just our thinking, values and actions, but our fundamental relationship to each other and our responsibility as custodians and stewards of planet Earth. We have to start revaluing the planet as truly our own home. In particular, not just the belief that we can mitigate or arrest climate change, but that we will and we are able to establish a global consensus to actually do this. So we believe that nature itself has the capacity, and it is the collective impact of all humans when considered as a single entity that needs to reorientate its activity to nature's priorities. And this starts at home in the place in which we live. So the Morecambe Bay curriculum then is a prenatal to 25 years curriculum that we started working on in 2019, and we've signed a 25-year agreement to establish this curriculum across Morecambe Bay. And prenatal means that we'll be working with pregnant mums, as well as 25-year-olds, as well as those people, local residents who are beyond the education system. And so it's truly an intergenerational curriculum. The curriculum is informed by the social cultural perspectives of the community, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the IPCC Report 6, traditional knowledge, craft and wisdom, stories of the Bay, specific places and notable people such as John Ruskin and Charlotte Mason. And it's open at the moment in terms of other influences that we might want to take into account. So children and young people will be involved in powerful projects that focus on the health of the Morecambe Bay ecosystem. That is to do with the land, the air, the water, the community and the economy. And each project will be considered fundamental to our future survival. So they're really important projects focusing on what it means to exist in this place. And the approach aligns the activity and actions of teaching and learning of the education system with the priorities of the Morecambe Bay environment itself. Importantly, the curriculum is being co-created by colleagues from education, health, community, business and the environment. And so we're attempting to align those priorities and resources of these different sectors to an environmental focus on Morecambe Bay. There are age-specific projects for early years, primary, secondary, further education, higher education, alternative provision, those in care, those not in employment, education and training, or in special schools. And children and young people will be involved in placements from the age of 4 years old, exploring their own interests and dreams with local community groups and businesses. And evidence of their experience will be captured in a Morecambe Bay curriculum e-portfolio. And this evidence will be used by employers, colleges and universities as children and young people follow their educational journey. Most importantly to the Morecambe Bay curriculum is that it's focusing on the health of the Bay ecosystem as a priority for all human activity. So repositioning the importance of human beings, that we are not more important than nature itself. We consider the Bay to be the heart and lungs of the place in which we live. This is our home, not an asset to be exploited. So we believe that it's important to look after our home, Morecambe Bay, and all living things and the physical environment itself. And we know that this relationship between ourselves and all living things is fundamental to our future existence. Therefore, all our projects focus on this actual relationship. Each project is eliciting stories of the Bay, not just from children and young people, but all living things and the landscape itself. And these stories are being captured 3 times a year, so the Morecambe Bay curriculum remains a positive, responsive and agile to the priorities of the Bay and its wider community. So the intention is that each year our projects will be strategically reviewed in relation to their impact on the health of the Bay ecosystem. So as I say, the lens of land, water, air, community and economy. And we'll be attempting to define new sustainable futures for the Bay based upon a researched evidence base of real world projects. So we're adopting a futures thinking approach to frame our projects that have a sustainable impact on the health of the Bay. We're also establishing national and international networks to share and inform our thinking and experience of designing a place-based curriculum. And these networks will support capacity building through 3 drivers of research, education and engagement that are shaping our mission to know our place, build a deeper sustainable relationship and be proactive in creating a sustainable future for the Morecambe Bay. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, Rob. And now it's only right, I think, that we hear from the community. So we're going to hear from Linda. Hi, Linda.
Hello, everyone. Yes, so I'm Linda Pye. I'm very much within the Morecambe Bay community. I'm a head teacher at a primary school in Rylands. primary and nursery school, but I also work alongside a lot of other head teachers and obviously children and professionals in developing the Morecambe Bay curriculum. I want to build on a bit of what Sam was saying about agency, but also specifically in relation to designing this Morecambe Bay curriculum that Robert's just spoken about. Okay, I'm going to start by just saying and recognising why that is so important. You know, it is the pupil's voice, it is their agency, it is the work that they're doing that we're listening to in terms of designing the curriculum. And they do have a very strong voice, and so they should, because it is their future. It is their future. That is what we are intending to do through the curriculum. But I would also say as well, in their voice that they have, we do need to trust what they have got to say. Because there's a real purity to it, as well as a real urgency in what the children and the young people in this area are saying. So how are we collecting their views? How are we listening to the children? How are we giving them agency? Well, we're doing this in a number of different ways. One of the ways is through the pupil parliament. So we have an active pupil parliament that runs across Lancaster and Morecambe schools, primary schools. Led by a wonderful lady called Mrs. Hamer, head teacher, and actually yesterday I was with the pupil parliament, and we were doing some work on COP26 and what that means to them, but also in relation to what they can do in this area. So like I say, they've got a strong voice already, and that is feeding into the work that we're doing on the Morecambe Bay curriculum quite rightly. I'm more than happy to answer some questions on that later in terms of their voice. So we're also as well collecting their views, their voice, what this curriculum should be, responding to their needs, their health needs, and their environment through specific projects. There's a couple of projects that I'll say a little bit more about. One is around Eden Bear, which, well, Eden Bear's yeah, I think a lot of people have been introduced to the bear across all of our schools and settings. So the bear goes to around these places, and the children tell the bear their stories, their past stories, their present stories, but also their hopes and their dreams and their aspirations for the future. And through the bear, of course, that is informing our curriculum, but also, and also changing directly the work and the practice within our schools as the bear travels around. Another project that I think would be interesting to speak about is one called Where the Wildings Are. It's a school grounds project. And again, it's a project where the children's voice and what they want and what they hope for is very, very important. So the approach to the projects is through a permaculture approach where everybody's voice is important, of course, including the children. And through that project, obviously, we're wanting to develop the curriculum as well as develop school grounds, its growing potential, its foraging potential, and its biodiversity. Again, I'm more than happy to answer questions around the projects as well later. Another way in which we're giving pupil voice and pupil agency, of course, is through how we teach, through our pedagogy and the pedagogy of the Morecambe Bay curriculum. And in terms of having an inquiry approach, having project-led approach and the powerful projects that Robert's spoken about, of course, we are going to give the children agency through that. But just in the classroom as well, you know, if we look at early years practice, it's all based on children's agency and what they do, and children noticing things, as wondering alongside those children and taking their inquiry further. And again, I think that's fundamental to curriculum design, but also as we move forward. So I just want to say then to finish in everything that I've said, because of that, because it's led by the children, it's led by the community, it's a bottom-up approach, it's evolving all of the time, and I think that's what we need to recognise. This isn't a curriculum that's written and it's just there and it's fixed. It is responsive to need and evolving all of the time, and the children's voice, our future, is very much within that. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that insight, Linda, and we'll be asking some questions on some of those projects a bit later. I'm going to zoom out now from somewhere dear to many of our hearts in Morecambe and out now into a more international perspective, speaking to Jason. Evening, Jason.
Evening, hello. I'm Jason Brooks. I work with ideation management for education and culture, and I'm with Eden Project. It used to be called Eden Project International. We all just think of us as Eden Project now, which is a good thing. We are not only in Cornwall and Morecambe, but we have projects and programs that are in Australia, New Zealand, Costa Rica, Colombia, Dubai, and 3 different places in China, from Western China in Sichuan province to near the Tibetan border to Tianjin, which is a very large city right next to Beijing. And then the one project that will be the second built Eden project in the world in opening 2023 is the Eden Project Qingdao, which is on the Shandong Peninsula, which is Shandong province, which is the province where Confucius comes from, so one of their big philosophical celebrities. In what I do, it has to reach across different cultures, and Eden team, whether it be in education or design or performance or any of the creative operational roles that it has, I'm there to assist them in crossing those cultures. My specialty is China, and so a lot of the work I've been doing started in and has been focusing on China. I'll get right into what the talk is about, which is the differences in culture when trying to do something together and the learning process that needs to take place. So basically put, a fish is just a fish. Unless you ask somebody from Mongolia or Tibet, and then a fish is also an ancestor. Or unless you ask a Christian, an early Christian especially, in that case, a fish is the symbol of Jesus Christ, the Savior. Or if you ask a Chinese person, a fish represents abundance because the language, it has the same syllable as the word for abundance. So at weddings, you will get things like pomegranates, which represent having many children, and a fish, or at least a symbol of a fish, which says, I hope you have an abundance of children. At least that was what was done before the one-child policy, which has since been repealed. So you have these different things in nature, which we all deal with in our curricula or our lessons or our talks, which are different things from the plant and animal world, but they all mean in the human mind, and especially in the different cultures, they all can symbolize a different thing. And so you can have a different take on them. And that's something that needs to be acknowledged and bridged when you're working with people and trying to construct either performances or lessons or indeed design and an architecture. There's something, those need to be taken on board. So you have to have a knowledge of their folklore and legend, definitely, whether they're conscious of it or not, the same way we're not very conscious sometimes when we're speaking words that of Shakespeare's, but they are definitely from Shakespeare or indeed from the Bible. The same thing happens in another language, in another culture. But so let's take another example is plum blossoms. So to us, plum blossoms represent the sign that spring is coming. I think we use that well with crocuses, things like that, to show that they blossom in the winter, and they are a harbinger of the coming spring. If you're a plum blossom friend in Chinese, That means that you're a friend who's there when it's really tough going. That means, you know, when it's at its coldest, you still blossom. You still come out for your friend. You're still there for them. So that's quite a different thing. An apple for us is the symbol of knowledge, or forbidden knowledge, especially. Or it can be, you know, the apple of my eye, someone's a symbol of someone you fancy, you think is lovely. For the Chinese, it's peace, because the language itself has the same syllable for the word for peace. So that's a very big difference. Bats. Bats is changing, but at the moment, still, to us, bats are a slightly sinister or evil thing. But to the Chinese, especially, bats are a symbol of good fortune or good luck. And that has to do with the wealth as well. The same sound for wealth or abundance or good fortune or good luck. However, since the pandemic, there has been a change in the perception of bats. I don't know how long that will last, and maybe the pangolins will get the worst of the bad rap. But there is this shift in that culture. I think you have there are several symbols. For instance, when you talk clouds and rain, you have to be careful, because clouds and rain also symbolize the act of love. So, you know, you have to be careful when you talk about storms and hurricanes and all that kind of stuff when you're dealing with China. So there's all these different things you need to take on board. But in addition to that, the same way an individual is a very complex entity, cultures are very complex entities. So they're not the same, they're not just this, everyone's the same thing and believes the same thing. There's divisions or groupings within any specific society. So there's the north of England as opposed to the south of England. There's the southwest as opposed to the northwest. Very much the same in many of the places we deal with and we work in Eden International. It's especially too in China, you get the differences in age. So a lot of people define themselves from the generation they were born in or the decade they were born in. So what we would know as millennials, they know as the 90s or post-90s generation. So I think there's a lot to go on there, but there's a lot of dilemmas. They're torturous, but also fascinating, and I'd love to answer any questions you have.
Thanks so much, Jason. Tonight, when we're talking about education in the context of the climate crisis, there's nothing quite like climate for joining the sort of cultural links from very place-based and local to right out to the whole planet. So it's really fresh to have that perspective. Thank you. And I'm going to pass over now to Liz to zoom us back into Morecambe and some of the wonderful work that you've been doing there. Evening, Liz.
Good evening. So I'm Liz Edwards, and I'm a researcher at Lancaster University with a background in digital technology, design and geography education. I'm also on the Morecambe Bay Curriculum Working Group for primary schools, special schools and early years. I'm going to talk about some examples of ongoing Morecambe-based projects. So for the last 5 years, I've been working on a research programme using digital technologies to increase understanding of environmental science and engagement with environmental change. And this has led to collaborations with researchers and teachers to develop a series of place-based projects combining outdoor environmental activities, arts, and in some cases, digital technologies. The projects involve noticing aspects of the environment in different ways. The first digital naturalist project is about increasing awareness of bird populations in local habitats, and it's run for several years in primary schools. It involves a guided walk to a local site where children learn to use binoculars and listen to bird calls with directional microphones. And then on return to school, the children learn to identify the sound patterns of bird calls using spectrograms. They make prints of the birds that they've seen using conductive ink, and then make a circuit and write code to play the call of the bird when the print is touched. The project culminates in the creation of an interactive audio display in which bird prints are pinned onto a large fabric image of the place visited earlier on the walk. And when the birds are touched, they create a soundscape for that habitat. The display is usually left in school for a while so that children involved can share their work with parents and the wider community. The next two projects are led by Serena Pilastri, who's a design researcher at Lancaster University. Biodiversity Logbooks is a project about noticing plants and their habitats to challenge plant blindness, which is otherwise known as plant awareness disparity. So this is the tendency to overlook plants in everyday life and perceive them as of lower value than animals. And it manifests in people's inability to recognise individual plant features and plant needs. So the first set of workshops focus on building skills to notice differences between individual plants. And the second set emphasises family similarities. And direct experiences of nature are combined with creative interventions to increase children's attention towards and care for their local environments. So the Biodiversity Logbook Kit provides prompts to notice and record observations in different ways. One of these ways is using cyanotype photography as an intentionally slow visualization process. So cyanotype paper turns blue when exposed to sunlight. So we use the technique to create silhouettes of plants that emphasize plant structure and leaf features, while also drawing attention to changing light levels through the seasons. A current secondary school project is Morecambe Bay Timescapes. This involves 14 to 18-year-olds creating potential future visions for coastal sites in Morecambe Bay, drawing on archive material, shoreline management plans, and data gathered from field trips. Timescapes aims to encourage reflection on the local impact of sea level change, extreme weather, and different flood management approaches. The project also highlights economic and social history to think about the wider way that climate change mitigation might inspire new ways of living. The future visions created by the young people will be turned into reels of stereoscopic images that will be shown on telescope-style viewers installed in locations studied by each school or college. These projects illustrate an approach that combines environmental science and arts with place-based activities to notice local environments. And I'd be happy to hear questions about them later. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing some of those, Liz. And from one side of the bay, particularly round to the other, we're going to hear from Alison now. Hi, Alison. Evening. Oh, you're on mute.
Classic. Hello, good evening, everyone. My name's Alison Wilkinson, and I chair the Cumbria Schools Working Group for the Morecambe Bay curriculum, and I lead a federation of schools in the South Lakes. So I'm talking to you today from Cumbria, as you say, nearly the other side of the bay. And it was interesting listening to all of those speakers who've gone before me this evening, because every single one of them said something that was a key thread in what I'm going to talk about, which is how do we create a curriculum within our schools that genuinely disrupts from within? That's the first question. What does that curriculum need to look like? And we're saying in Cumbria, it shouldn't be a set of bolt-on disparate activities. It needs to have coherence. How do we build it? How do we get from this prenatal phase to postgraduate and adulthood, making something that genuinely takes somebody on a journey that makes sense and that has sequence and form and connects, so that it's not a series of individual experiences. And then the big question I wrestle with all the time here is, how do we land that in schools? Schools under pressure, schools with accountability measures, inspectoral frameworks, outcomes data, fear, anxiety, pressure, exhaustion. I'm not saying we haven't got fabulous teachers who are incredibly passionate. I'll come on to that later. But how do we land our curriculum in schools as they think about their curriculum more widely? And how do we empower and enable our teachers to really embrace the mission and do what we need them to do? There's a shift in education. I don't know if people who are not working in schools are as aware of it as people like Linda and I are. We used to be judged on our outcomes data, and it was a dreadful phase, let's face it, being judged on exam results. Essential but not sufficient is what we would say. That's shifted now, and we're embracing that change because suddenly we're being held to account on the quality of education, rightly so. And that's based on three I's, as we call them. What's our curriculum intent? What's our plan for curriculum implementation? And what does the impact of that look like? And then encouraging our schools to adopt the Morecambe Bay curriculum and to start to build it with us. We're actually looking at the answers to some big curriculum questions that we're answering anyway in schools. So historians are answering these questions, English specialists, mathematicians, primary phase specialists. So I thought I'd just run through them, because I think an understanding of those powerful questions about curriculum building in schools and how they apply to Morecambe Bay is probably a really helpful way of drawing some of these threads together. The first question that people are asking is around this notion of cultural capital. And we're being asked by people like Ofsted to present to young people the best that has been thought or said. Now, the question that we need to ask as practitioners is, whose values? Who's this relevant to? I was really interested to hear Jason talk about cultural difference here, because instead of, this white British version of the best that has been thought or said, we need a rich, diverse global perspective on that if we're to deliver the Morecambe Bay curriculum. So what's valued, what's relevant? And this is where Linda's storytelling comes in. Those voices need to be part of broadening that narrative base that will help us to decolonise our curriculum and understand what we mean by our cultural capital. So that's the first question we're wrestling with. The second one, again, chimes beautifully with what Linda was saying about agency and activism. Are we educating young people to reproduce an existing social context, or are we educating young people to think the as yet unthought? Are we giving them access to the intellectual tools they need to create radical change? And I'm suggesting all of our curriculum intent statements in schools need to say that's what we're doing, radical change. How do we give young people the tools to do that? And then we talk about what is our duty when we're educating the next generation. We need to give them a shared language of abstract concepts. And if you look at the questions around the bay, the ecological principles of nature, that shared language is very abstract for young people. How do we teach that language? How do we share it with them? How do we give them these tools for precise thought? And what is the objective underlying knowledge that we give them so that we have this participation in a democratic society coming from what we've provided them with as a toolkit? The next question everybody's asking who are delivering subjects in schools is, what's our substantive knowledge? What's there as established fact? And what's our disciplinary knowledge? Schools are being told we've got to deliver a knowledge-rich curriculum, and that's a reference to this idea of substantive knowledge. So what are the facts you teach in science? What are the facts you teach in geography? But that's not rich knowledge on its own. What you need is, how are those truths arrived at within disciplines? Now, I think the challenge for the Morecambe Bay curriculum is that this is an amalgamation of subject disciplines. Do we understand the difference between substantive and disciplinary knowledge? And do we understand how we're seeking ongoing truths in environmental education, and what are the disciplines there? And I think that's a massive challenge and a really fascinating piece of work for us. Then we get to a hugely important question. What's the balance of knowledge against skills? Now, what we've got is an inspectoral framework and a Department for Education that are asking us all to have a knowledge-rich curriculum. They are privileging knowledge, and they're privileging that through an instructional pedagogy, which is underpinned by quite a lot of quite compelling research. And there's a binary representation of knowledge versus skills. I think we need to be looking at what you do in the outdoors to teach knowledge as children are participating in activity, so that it's less binary and more understood. But for that, we need to do some research around the pedagogies of outdoor education and understand what that looks like. How do we pass our knowledge on during activities? And how do we understand what knowledge that needs to be? And that has to be a more thoughtful and deliberative process than just experience something together. The next question that people are asking is around sequencing, and I think that's important to us. You know, how is knowledge developed in our subject area? How is knowledge about the environment developed? Is it hierarchical? Is it cumulative? Is it a spiral? Do we understand order? Do we understand coherence? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, because we're looking at projects and each child will experience a different set of projects. How do we make sure that it creates a coherent, sequenced and structured knowledge base, looking at that rich knowledge that we mean by that? And there's a key issue around sequencing, which is at what age do you introduce to young people abstract concepts? Because there's quite a lot of work around how if you get people to be very worried about the environment too early, that can make them very, very afraid and less likely to engage with this. So the idea is that love needs to come before these abstract concepts and knowledge. Don't make them too scared too soon is basically the idea there. And then finally, we ask about the threshold concepts in our subject. These are often called the jewels in the curriculum. I like to think of them as lampposts along a dark country lane. So each time you get to one, something lights up and you understand. So these are the things that are difficult for young people to grasp at first, but once they've grasped them, moves them on into understanding the subject in a more profound, more abstract, more complex way. For instance, if you're a historian, a threshold concept would be there are different views of what happened in the past. In science, there are concepts around photosynthesis that have to be got through before you understand what's happening in the seasons. And how does that cohere? Do we understand what the threshold concepts are in our projects, and do we understand what order they need to come in so that people can make sense of what they're learning about the environment? And then we get finally to the question about how do you connect all of that intent, that understanding of how we build knowledge, skills, understanding and emotional response to the environment into implementation? What do our teachers need to know and do? How do they collaborate in a dialogic process of the curriculum making? How do we create our community of practice? How do we root our choices about pedagogy in evidence? We're doing a piece of work around that at the moment. That'll be really interesting to see. How do we align what we want to do around the environment with this wider curriculum thinking? How do we achieve this change from within? And then the final question, which every practitioner asks me, is where do I get the professional development from that will allow me to do this work? So that's a view from Cumbria. It's not necessarily about Cumbria, but I'm very happy to take questions about the Cumbrian context out of which this thinking is coming later on. But thank you very much for now.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Alison. And there's so much richness there and questions that are coming out of this. So that leads us on nicely to asking some questions.